my doctor father is fond of saying, most writings that we have access to are written to someone, from someone to someone. And this seems to certainly be the case with a lot of like ancient Christian literature. So, to whom were these texts written? And it seems to me it's much more difficult to make this. I don't know if I'm constantly thinking about that which can solve the most problems while creating the fewest problems, right? Sort of an Occam's razor sort of a thing. And to me, arguing that this is coming from a fictive group that's trying to influence people, but it's these documents that only have several hundred words, to me, that runs into a lot more problems in the long run than saying, okay, these were written as a part of a correspondence that belongs to a certain group. Let's try to figure out where the seams are and where the problems are instead of going the opposite way.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Christopher Skinner. He's professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Loyola University in Chicago. We're going to be discussing this new book that he co-edited with his colleague Christopher Siglenix entitled The Johannine Community in Contemporary Debate. We're excited to have this conversation. This is the first episode we've had on anything related to the Gospel of John or the letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And Chris is a expert in the Johannine literature, among other things. So really excited to have him on. Let me just give you a little bit. His CV is quite extensive, but he's done a lot of work in this area. He's author, editor of over 9 books, published over 30 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. And his research is expansive. But among the things he does, we talk about some of these other things, is very much focused on Johannine stuff. So excited to talk about this book with you. And I think there's a lot of interesting insights in here to glean. It does get quite scholarly, but that's what this channel is in part about, is introducing you to the best in biblical studies and scholarship. So I think this is a great book to do that. And for those that are currently researchers or students in Gospels, this will give you a lot of really interesting ideas for further consideration and study. Before we jump in, for those that are new to the channel, if you're watching this on YouTube, please do make sure you're subscribed to our channel. If you can give this a like and comment, that really helps us as we continue to grow. If you're listening to us on podcast, if you could make sure you're following us and leaving a rating and comments, that also is really, really helpful. This is part of what we do here at the Center for Bible Study, is through digital media, make biblical scholarship available. Another thing that we're doing is continuing classes, both online and in person. So if you're wanting to grow and continue on in your study of the Bible, please do consider becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. That gets you access to all of our past class materials and entrance into all of our future classes. And it helps support the work that we're continuing to do here on the YouTube channel. So if you want to become a member, any recurring monthly donation, could be $1, $5, $10, whatever it is that works for you and you feel is appropriate, that makes you a member. There's a link posted in the description that you can join in that way. And yeah, with that, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Dr. Skinner. All right. Well, we're excited to be back on the podcast, and I'm really excited to have on a colleague and friend, Dr. Christopher Skinner. Chris, it's great to have you on. We're excited to talk about your new book.
Hey, thanks for having me, Max. I appreciate you and appreciate your work. And I've seen a couple of the online snippets and listened to a couple of things on Spotify. So it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Great. Yeah, no, we're excited. And of course, this is a book you co-edited with another Christopher Siglenix. So that's great. If you wouldn't mind just kind of giving us a little bit of your own background, even if brief, kind of your journey into biblical studies, and then a little bit about what you currently do in your current role as a teacher and researcher.
Yeah, so it all started on a cold, crisp evening in 1973. No, I'm kidding. So I basically, I have a trajectory that I think is fairly similar to a lot of people who end up in this field. I grew up evangelical. I grew up in the South, in the Southeast of Virginia. I grew up Southern Baptist. I went to an evangelical seminary out of a state university in North Carolina. And then ended up doing my PhD at the Catholic University of America under Frank Maloney. But I was there during just a really incredible time. Joseph Fitzmyer was there. there, Frank Matera was there, Frank Maloney was there, Ray Collins was there. Over in Hebrew, they had Michael O'Connor. It was just an incredible time to be there in the life of the university. Finished there in '08, but started teaching in '05. Currently, I am a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at Loyola University Chicago in the theology department at Loyola University Chicago. I've been there as a professor for 9 years, finishing my 6th year as director of graduate programs. Before that, I was at a small liberal arts college in Eastern North Carolina for 6 years. And then for 5 years before that, I taught as an instructor of biblical studies, kind of a glorified adjunct at St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. So I've kind of, like a lot of us, moved around a lot and kind of had a circuitous path a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think it's very similar for many of us. Interest in the Bible for various reasons and all over the place.
Yeah,
that's good. And your research interests, we're going to be obviously talking about John and the Johannine writings today. Yeah. Aside from John, what other areas you want to talk about? I know you got the commentary on the Gospel of Thomas that you're working on.
Yeah, so much of my academic work has concentrated on the canonical Gospels, primarily John and Mark. Early in my career, I did a lot of stuff with narrative criticism. Specifically, I did some edited volumes on characterization in John and Mark. Like you said, I've done some stuff on Thomas. My next big project after the project I'm working on now will be the Anchor Yale commentary on the Gospel of Thomas. In the last few years, I've turned almost exclusively to working on Mark, with the exception of this edited book that just came out. I have a little book in Zondervan Academic has relaunched the Word Biblical Theme series. So in the new Word Biblical Theme series, I have the volume of Mark coming out actually in a few months, this June or July. And then my current project is a project with Baker Academic on Mark's Christology, in which I've been able to engage some of your really excellent work on the subject. And I really do love your dissertation. It's been quite helpful for me. And the tentative title of that book is Messiah and Son of God, Mark's Christology in Kaleidoscopic Perspective. And as we were just talking right before this, I was just granted my first sabbatical in 20 years of teaching. So I'm hoping to get a significant amount of work done on that book I have the first chapters done. I'm hoping to get the probably 3 or 4 more chapters done between May and January of 26. So
that's awesome. Yeah. So crossed, you're a busy guy. You've got a lot of good stuff going. That's awesome. Yeah. Fantastic. So we're going to get into questions about the Johannine community and all this good stuff. Yeah. You want to share maybe just real briefly about the kind of how this project came about and why you and the other Christopher thought that this was the time for this project?
Yeah, this is great. So a little bit about my interest in the subject. I started my sort of entree into the field of gospel studies in the late '90s, early 2000s, when the consensus on this whole question was still kind of largely in favor of gospel communities, right? Not just the Johannine community, but this idea that the Gospels had been written for specific communities or social networks or specific churches. And then I noticed that as I progressed through my doctoral program and started in the early part of my teaching that the consensus had waned and that there was even more energy being directed toward almost a rejection of the position that had been, advanced for so many years. So I kind of had this idea in my mind for about 8 or 9 years that it was something that I wanted to pursue. But busy as we are with teaching and writing, and then on the other side with our families, I never got around to it. And then not this last time, we were just in San Diego for the SBL, but I think it was 2019. In fact, it was November of 2019. I had an opportunity to meet up with Chris Siglineks. I had been an external reader on his dissertation. That's how we originally met. And so he said, "Hey, let's get together. I want to, as a newbie to publishing, I want to kind of, throw some stuff at you and see what you think." And so he said, what are some strategies for publishing? And I gave him some things, but one of the 4 bullet points I gave him was, attach yourself to someone who's a little more senior, pitch to them a book idea, and split up the work and let it go. So he reaches out to me about 3 months later and he says, "Okay, I'm taking you up on your advice, except I'm asking you, what projects do you have?" And I said, "I would love to do something in the Johannine community." And both of us lit up with ideas right away. So that's kind of the genesis of the book. And then the cool thing was when we started approaching people, everybody was super enthusiastic about the topic. We only had one person drop out, and that was because she had some other stuff going on, some family stuff, but also some administrative stuff with her school. But everybody else was super enthusiastic about the prospect.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, I mean, it's an important topic, and yeah, it's cool that you guys took it up, and you just got a great collection of scholars here together, taking different approaches, which is super, super cool.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a good testament to the importance of collaborative work in scholarship too. A lot of what pushes our discipline ahead is when people do partner up and team up and use their various gifts to produce something.
I think so. And especially when you're dealing with a work where you know you're going to have divergent perspectives. And so that's going to create a dialogue, not just around the creation of the project, but then around the ripple effects it has in its reception.
Yeah, absolutely. So these the divergent perspectives are kind of the, I guess, reaction for several decades now, post a kind of consensus that had developed around how to approach the Johannine community. And you talk in the introduction a little bit about that. And there's two people that everybody kind of references as being foundational to this model, J. Louis Martin and Raymond Brown. So, what can you tell us about why scholars propose this kind of community model for the Gospel of John and then the letters for 2nd, 3rd John? And what particularly should we know about Martin and Brown's proposals?
Yeah, that's helpful, and there's so much there, right? So, rein me in if I start to say too much. But even before we talk about the Johannine community, right? As far back as the early 20th century, gospel scholarship had basically operated under the nearly unquestioned assumption that the Gospels were written by or for individual communities, right? And this was coming out of the eras that were pretty much dominated by form criticism and redaction criticism, and this assumption basically. It reigned as one of the assured results of modern gospel scholarship, really until the late 90s, right? Around this period that I was just talking about when I was studying. And so one of these foundational assumptions was that the Gospels reflected kind of what we might call a fractured portrait, where the reader could see elements of the life setting of Jesus, the actual life settings of the historical Jesus in the 20 CE, as well as some of the elements of the historical situation, the historical conflicts of those who were responsible for producing the Gospels in the 70s to late 90s. These were, for everybody who's listening who may not know, these are the Sitzumleben Jesu and the Sitzumleben der Kirche, the life setting of Jesus and the life setting of the church, respectively. So in other words, the Gospels were vehicles for the lives of Jesus that were set in the context of some of the major concerns and conflicts of early Christian communities. And so for these critics, the form critics and the redaction critics, the Gospels were at least partially windows into the communities that had produced them, right? So if this is your foundation, then it follows then that at least some of the activity, some of the dialogue in the Gospels consisted of materials that were intentionally put into the mouth of Jesus and his interlocutors, and they were framed to reflect the concerns of these communities, right? So the end product was a text that interprets or that interpreters rather could kind of read at two levels. And so this was one of the foundational assumptions that we draw from Martin's book, right? That there's a two-level story, the story of Jesus and the story of the community. So Martin's book, History and Theology in the Fourth Gospel, appeared in 1968, and it proceeded along the following lines. Okay, first, the emergence of the Gospel of John can be accounted for, at least partially, by tracing the backstory of the conflict between Jesus and a group known as Hoyudaioi, or the Jews, across the face of the Gospel. Now, if I can just briefly say, the question of how to understand the phrase Hoyudaioi is fraught.
Right.
And there's not enough space in just one podcast episode to deal with that. But I just want to pause and say that the misuse, the mistranslation of this particular phrase has led to just a long history of lamentable Christian anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish interpretation. Okay? I'm going to just bracket that off to the side, but it always
that's helpful. I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah.
So the first is that this conflict can partially be traced by looking at the emergence of the gospel, rather, can be understood by tracing this conflict. Second, the conflict is not rooted in the experience of the historical Jesus, right? Rather, it's rooted in the community to which John is writing. So we have to search for the origins of this conflict in the Sitzumleben of the author or authors, okay? Third, one key to the interpretive agenda that's laid out by Martin, is an understanding of this important Greek term, aposunagogos, out of the synagogue, which appears 3 times in John 9:22, 12:42, 16:2. And it's a term that's really otherwise unattested in ancient Greek literature before its appearance in the 4th gospel, okay? And then 4th, John envisions a scenario in which, this is according to Martin at least, John envisions a scenario in which some of these Jews, these hoi Judaioi, are expelling other Christ-believing Jews, that is Christians, from the synagogue. And this is important since there's no evidence of such a wide-scale conflict during the time of Jesus. Martin argues that this must take place later. And he introduces things like the Birkat Hamanim, or the so-called curse against the heretics, which later Jews pronounced against later Christians. And these Jesus-believing Jews, he believes, are the aposunagogoi, the ones who are cast out, or to use Martin's phrase, who are smoked out from synagogue fellowship, right? Now, this thesis pretty much carries the day for decades, right? And it's been critiqued, and I think we probably will get to that. And there's some potential anachronisms there, but this thesis was so generative and so constructive, and really tried to take account of not just the world of the text, but the worlds behind the text, that a lot of people really bought into it. And so, this is written in 68, and as I trace in my opening chapter, it's pretty much lauded by everybody who reviews it as this is a foundational work that is basically going to be used for decades, and that critique goes on to be prophetic. And even today, I feel like you can't talk about this subject, even if you reject the notion of a Johannine community, without talking about Martin and then ultimately Brown. It's sort of when I teach Mark, and I'm sure you feel this way, you can't talk about the Messianic secret without talking about Vreda. Nobody agrees with Vreda's conclusions anymore, but he asks the questions in a way that generated all of these new insights, right? So I feel like that's how we should think about Martin's work, right?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Yep. So the idea of what we have in the Gospel of John is a window into conflicts of this Johannine community. They're this community of Jesus followers that has been kicked out of the synagogue, and so the hostility between them and the other Jews in the narrative is actually reflective of this dynamic, essentially. Right. Okay. Yep.
Right, and it's helpful that you use the word reflective, because one of the critiques that gets made later, not just about the Johannine community construct, but about all gospel community constructs, is this idea of mirror reading, right? Like seeing the history of the community and really having that be the only thing we're really looking for. There's nothing historical at all. It's all about the history of the community. So.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Good. So then, roughly a decade later, 11 years later, Martin's Union Theological Seminary in New York colleague, Ray Brown, publishes Community of the Beloved Disciple. And, he's building upon the insights there, but he's moving in certainly a more speculative direction, and I would say arguably a more tendentious direction, right? Excuse me. In fact, I have a quote that I pulled out here from Brown's preface, and I cite this in the book. Brown writes, "I must warn the reader that my reconstruction claims at most probability, and if 60% of my detective work is accepted, I shall be happy indeed," end quote. So I mean, if you look at, I remember doing this for my doctoral comps when I was at CUA. We had to trace a bunch of things for day 3. And one of them was the history of the Johannine community. And I remember there's this chart with all of these little lines and and I'm going, there's no way. I mean, I love Brown. Brown was a preeminent scholar, but it's too much, right? So building upon Martin's work, Brown sees 4 hypothetical stages to the community, right? Phase 1 is there as an original group of Christ-confessing Jews. But that group also consisted of followers of John the Baptist. These were later joined by a second group that had some Samaritans, right? And this is why for Brown, we have John 4, this whole conversation with Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Whereas in other Gospels, we don't see much of the Samaritans. Phase 2 is roughly 90 CE. And this is the period during which the 4th Gospel was composed. And it presupposes this community situation that's envisaged by Martin and later by Brown. In that same phase, Brown argues that the beloved disciple was a real person that was living at this time and was connected to the community. Phase 3 is roughly 10 years later, 100 CE. It's the period during which the 3 epistles were written. And this is when during this third stage is when another group comes in, and it's a group that Brown labels as the secessionists, right? And he looks in particular at things like 1 John 2, they went out from us, but they did not belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained. But by their going, they showed that none of them are of us. That whole thing, those are the people who have seceded from the community. And then phase 4 is when ultimately the heterodox secessionists outnumber the proto-Orthodox Christians. And then ultimately the whole group is subsumed into or absorbed into later movements like Gnosticism or Docetism or Montanism. So, it's obviously a lot there, and there's a lot of speculation there. But really, Martin and Brown are like this two-headed kind of monster that that really just dominates the field until the late 90s.
Yeah. And Brown, obviously, the more kind of elaborate, multi-staged account. Just because I'm sure people will be curious about this, does he does not think the beloved disciple is John, the son of Zebedee? He's a different figure, or what does Brown say? I can't recall.
It's been so long since I've read his treatment of that. He does have a treatment of it in his commentary. I'm tempted here to say no, but I'll have to go back and look and see.
Okay. And that's in contrast to others who think that the beloved disciple is like a literary invention or something. Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, that's been in my own work, and I'm obviously relying upon the work of others, but that's been my own argument that the beloved disciple is ostensibly this key figure that the readership can connect with. I've said elsewhere that the beloved disciple beckons us from the pages of the narrative. Follow Jesus as I have followed him, and you too can become a disciple whom Jesus loves. Not everybody buys that, but I tend to see it more as a literary device. But you have people like Paul Anderson and Richard Bauckham and others who argue that it is a real person, that maybe it's John the Elder, but maybe not the John the son of Zebedee. There's lots of views that are still operative that are considered standard fare. Yeah,
good. And so this then becomes like the dominant view. I mean, you can't hard to overstate the significance of Raymond Brown's anchor volume commentaries, that those become kind of standard. And so the image that people have of John writing for a community, it seems to me that actually lasts longer than it does for other gospels, right? Like with the synoptic gospels, the idea of communities behind them is still persistent, as you say, into the latter half of the 20th century, but it's kind of waning. But most people today, if they take like an introduction course or look at an introduction textbook on the New Testament, they're probably still going to get this impression that John is kind of this, and the letters are kind of this distinct thing, and there's likely a distinct audience behind that. So when does that begin to wane? I mean, or when does that begin to get questioned? And what are the reasons for that? And obviously, there's a number of them that are discussed by the authors in your book. But.
This is a great question. And actually, one of the things you said about there being multiple writings associated with a John, or with even the same type of grammar and syntax, right? This is going to get questioned even in the book by people like Hugo Mendez and Elizabeth Corsar, who are going to argue that these are intentional kind of fakes or forgeries, or an opportunity to kind of copy these sorts. And we can get to that in a minute. But so when does this begin? When does this consensus begin to fall apart? I would say that there's sort of three different things that happen, and they're not all related, but they're all happening around the same time, right? So first, you have in the late 90s, you have an awareness among some of sort of potential anachronisms in the theories of Martin and Brown. The most important of which is this whole emphasis on the Birkat Hamanim, or the curse against the heretics. And they're going to argue that this is a much later tradition, not really appearing in a codified form until maybe the 9th or 10th century. And even if it's not codified until then, it probably only goes back, in an oral form, just a few centuries. And so if this is a key part, say, of Martin's theory, then of course, one of the major legs of his hypothesis falls apart, right? So it's a pinpointing of certain historical inaccuracies or anachronisms that causes some people to begin doubting, right? I would say that the second piece is, I think, probably the one that is the most significant, right? And that's the publication in 1998 of Richard Bauckham's edited book, The Gospels for All Christians, right? This was the book that kind of, dropped like a bomb in the middle of gospel scholarship and begged to be answered. And it's an edited volume, but probably the opening essay by Bauckham, is the one that's gotten the most attention. And it's this idea that, listen, the Gospels are widely circulated early on. We have evidence of this. The Gospels are not like epistles that are written for parochial communities, and yet they're written for a wider audience. Therefore, the Gospels were written for all Christians, and we should abandon this whole idea of mirror reading. And listen, I disagree with a lot of what Bauckham has to say in that, but as I argue, even in my opening essay to the book, there's a necessary corrective here. There's a necessary corrective, and I got this even when I began some of the critical reading, especially in historical Jesus research for my doctoral studies. Right, you would get these recreations of the gospel communities, and here's what they would do: they would say, "Oh, the Gospel of John, there's nothing historical in the Gospel of John. There's no way we can believe that this highly exalted Jesus of the fourth Gospel corresponds in any way to the historical Jesus," right? But then over here is a highly detailed, very structured, sort of reconstruction of the community of John. And we will defend this with just utmost conviction. So the actual text itself has no historicity, but my reconstruction can be counted on with just laser accuracy, right? And I feel like that is one of the things that, for me, Bauckham's necessary corrective helped to sort of overthrow, or at the very least nuance, right? Now, again, I think Bauckham is incorrect. And I think there's a really helpful article in a book that was edited by Edward Klink early to maybe 2005, 2006. There's an essay in there by Craig Blomberg in which he makes a really helpful argument that, look, yes, two things can be true. And I like to say this to my doctoral students all the time. Multiple things can be true at the same time, right? Can the documents have been written for a community, or I like to say in my own work, for a social network of churches, and have also been widely disseminated throughout the Roman Empire? The answer to that is yes. And I think he makes a really helpful argument of that. But a lot of people, especially people on the more conservative end of the theological spectrum, really bought into Bauckham's work. You and I are familiar with this from our background in the evangelical world. And they said, yes, this. And for some people, I think they bought into it out of a sense of real intellectual honesty, but others, I think, bought into it because it helps them avoid dealing with some of the thornier questions that we have to deal with when we deal with history as it relates to the Bible. So I would say that's the second leg that, in my reading, caused people to kind of abandon the community constructs altogether. The third is a little more circuitous. I think it develops a little more slowly and incipiently, but then sort of grows up. And I would say that's the literary turn in biblical studies that really starts ostensibly in the early 80s, but then becomes a full-blown enterprise within biblical scholarship in the 90s and going forward. And that's where a lot of my own scholarship has been located. And this is not so much that people reject the idea of gospel communities, as much as the fact that their work is not concerned with the genesis of the text, or is not as concerned with questions about the world behind the text as it is with the world of the text. Now, I've tried to make the point, I have a footnote on this in the book, but I've tried to make the point in multiple articles and in book chapters that anybody who's going to be doing narrative work responsibly is going to have to show a concern for the world behind the text, right? Any good narrative work has to show a concern for both the literary questions and the historical questions. But I think a lot of that literary work just kind of disregarded kind of these questions about the genesis of the text, and that led to that being abandoned kind of even more. At least that's my read. Or those are kind of
I agree with that. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Yeah, especially the last one. I think, when literary criticism first broke in, biblical studies is always kind of like a few decades behind whatever the discipline is that's being appropriated, So when literary criticism first came in, I think it really wasn't very concerned at all with the world behind the text, but there has since been a corrective, and people have realized, like, hey, we have to think about this much, and we have to think about literary criticism in light of like ancient literary practices,
Right,
not
for
just
sure.
reading a modern novel or whatever, as it were,
Yeah.
But I remember reading Culpepper's The Anatomy of the Fourth Gospel, in seminary, and that was a great example of kind of this, what at the time was a kind of new, innovative inbreaking of literary criticism into the study of John's Gospel. And it's like a completely, if you're thinking, if you're coming at it from Brown and Martin and thinking about it as a window into history, it's just a very different way of looking at it, because now you're looking, what is this literary text made up of, and how does it mean in light of its various parts? And so it's a different kind of questions.
Yeah, back in 2020, I wrote a response article to, well, a little bit awkwardly, one of my former colleagues, Cam Von Walde, who had published a thing in NTS where he was critiquing narrative readings of the Jews in the Fourth Gospel, and just kind of dismissing, like, oh, these people aren't not really doing serious work, and he was very dismissive. And I the article was published in 2020 in CBQ. If anybody wants to read it, it's basically looking at narrative readings and saying, hey, wait, there's more going on here. And in that article, I say, like, read the commentaries, read the articles by people like Andrew Lincoln, Adele Reinhardt, my own Dr. Father Frank Maloney. You will see a tremendous amount of really solid historical work, hand in hand with really incredible awareness of what's going on literarily across the text. And so it's often people who either lack imagination or who lack exposure to broader reading in our field who attempt to say that the literary is not engaging the historical, and vice versa in contemporary scholarship.
Yeah, for sure. And so one of the things that I think your book shows really well is like there's not like for most of the contributors, there's not a full scale abandonment of the question of like audience behind the text, but there is, for those that are interested in that question, there's much more circumspection around how you get there. Methodologically, how we do that. And then for others, they're just saying, but they're saying that's not unimportant, but there's other questions to ask as well. Like, for example, what kind of audience does this text create? So we could imagine how how someone reading John's Gospel and the letters, like, we could ask what type of communities the text imagines, and we don't have to necessarily say that that is equivalent in a one-for-one sense with an actual historical community. It may be part of a writer's rhetorical project or whatever.
And we always have to account for multiple angles of reception. I mean, this is the sort of thing I'm doing in my kaleidoscopic approach to Mark's Christology. I mean, do we privilege a Jewish frame over a non-Jewish Roman frame, which, some people say, well, it's got to be written for Jews. It's got to be written for a Roman audience. And, when you and I, we might sit together in an audience where we hear something preached or proclaimed, and we might get a lot of the same things based upon our shared experience as men in America with very similar, educational trainings. And yet based upon, I think you grew up in California, right? I grew up on the East Coast. We're going to get very different things. And so, we always have to take into account multiple angles of real reception as well, right? Yeah, no, that's great.
So the to get to kind of the essays in the volume, I'm not going to ask you necessarily to speak to a particular essay, but feel free to touch on the points that you'd like. I'm curious to kind of get your sense on, like, obviously there's a variety of approaches that the writers take in your book, that scholars take. Are there places where, after you kind of sit back and having written the introduction to the book and obviously read through the contributors, I'm sure numerous times, are there places where you say, I think there is some points of consensus, new consensus emerging, or at least places where, like, it seems to be like we're moving in this direction now, kind of.
Right. Yeah. And so I think consensus is a tough word because I do think there's still a pretty big divide between people who want to embrace the idea of a Johannine community and those who want to reject it. In fact, I mean, if you have 7 essays in the book that are writing sort of constructive ideas, 5 of those are leaning in the direction of a Johannine community, and 2, which are very similar, are leaning in a direction against that. I do think, when I actually talk to people in the field, I feel like it does sort of split down the middle a little bit more than our book did, right? In terms of what we have in the book, what I loved about the 5 essays that argued in favor of some modified understanding of a Johannine community were a couple of things. One was that most of them moved away from the language of Martin and Brown and started to build a constructive case upon completely new ground, right? So, 3 of the essays in that middle section are using kind of cognitive linguistic approaches or social scientific or sociological approaches. So looking at ways to sort of salvage maybe the very best of the Martin and Brown hypotheses while also moving in different directions. I also really in particular loved, if I can say probably my, I don't want to, all the essays are excellent. Probably one of my favorite in the book is Andy Byers. And I like, as a human, I think Andy Byers is an exceptional human. I also think he's a great scholar. And his whole notion of Johannine world building, right? And for those who haven't read the book, he uses Tolkien as a somewhat contemporary analog for how to think about the way Tolkien builds his universe in the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy, and how there's a kind of a Johannine universe and how we can think about it in that way. To me, that's really helpful as someone who likes biblical studies, but also likes reading and likes storytelling and likes narrative and the way narrative worlds are developed. So there's that. In terms of the other side, what I did notice about the 2 essays that are kind of moving away from this is the essays by Hugo Mendez and Elizabeth Corsar. I should stop and say, Hugo's a good friend, and Hugo's just an excellent scholar. And even though I disagree with him on this, he's written a really, really good article in JSNT. I want to give the exact reference. JSNT 2020, did the Johannine community exist? And he's building upon that essay here, where he's basically arguing, no, not so much. There's a kind of a lineage of falsely attributed works written by potentially different authors with different social matrices. And they're influencing readers across the spectrum of sort of second century Christianity. And similarly, Elizabeth Corsar is arguing this as well, but doing it kind of in a way that's in conversation with the sort of work that Robin Walsh is doing right now. Robin Walsh's book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, where she's, kind of looking at these things being created among a group of what she calls elite cultural producers. And so I think that
that's a Stanley Stowers term, I believe.
Yeah. She's a student of Stowers, right?
Right.
So that sort of work, the sort of work that Hugo and Elizabeth do, I find when I talk to people, maybe is not the new consensus, but it seems to be capturing the imagination of a lot of people. Hugo actually has a book coming out fairly soon where he goes into this in much greater detail. I've had an opportunity to read a couple things as works in progress. So I think if there's going to be a new consensus, I think it probably will emerge in this new, more skeptical direction. And a lot of people have really bought on into Robin's work as well. So you're dealing with this work with all sorts of stuff during the second sophistic and things that are coming out of the classical world. And a good friend of mine is James Barker, who has a book coming out right now called Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. And he and Robin are sort of lockstep in this. So I do see if there's a consensus emerging. I don't know that it's what's reflected in our book as much as it's reflected in those latter 2 chapters that are more skeptical. At least if I'm reading the tea leaves, that's what I see more in my conversations with other Johannine scholars.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So kind of the move to situate these writers within the kind of context of like Greco-Roman literary practices and understand it that way, which makes a certain degree of sense. I was thinking about, and this probably just reflects my ignorance to an extent, but I could see some of the arguments. I think part of where it starts to get a little, well, I don't know. I mean, I should say I don't necessarily follow that train to begin with, but like, as I was kind of thinking about like take 3rd John, for example, right? What does a text like that achieve as a kind of fictive? Like, in what ways does that really carry forward the legacy of this writing practice? And what does it really achieve for the status of the pseudepigrapher to write 3rd John?
I'm with you 100%. I mean, in fact, I had a chance to, along with Alicia Myers, I had a chance to respond to Hugo on this very question at the Atlanta Theological Colloquium or Atlanta New Testament Colloquium a few years ago. We did it over Zoom during COVID. And this was one of the very questions that I raised. I mean, you're not looking at something that's so substantial. I mean, you're not looking at a gospel. You're not looking at something that's multiple leaves in an ancient codex. You're looking at something that's, roughly a couple hundred words. How does it really advance? So I'm with you 100%. And I think that's one of the things that Hugo and Elizabeth and others have to do a little more work to convince me. But again, I think from talking with some people in the field, some people are already firmly convinced that this is a thing. So
yeah. Well, I mean, certainly the practice is well attested, right? It's not a question of whether the practice is well attested, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, he uses the argument of data over models, right? Which is interesting. It came up in the book, but in this case, it would be kind of I guess the pushback would be your model that this is a thing that's happening seems to be dictating how you're handling the data.
Right.
Anyway, it's interesting, and it's interesting for me as someone who's not a Johannine specialist to hear that you see this movement, kind of going in that direction. That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not for it. Obviously, I still,
no.
When I teach, I mean, I'm going to, like I said, I'm doing a doctoral course on, or a graduate course on the Gospel of John in just a few weeks. And the third week, we look at Hugo's work in this JSNT article, and we look at several others who are arguing for a community. And I'm asking students to make up their mind, but I put my cards on the table and say, look, I'm going to argue social network. I'm going to argue, if we're thinking just gospel communities in general, I'm going to kind of be in favor. But when it comes to the Johannine literature, I'm definitely going to be in favor. And I'm on record in print saying this very thing. So
no, but it's helpful to have all these, like the debate, right? That's the point of the book, is to have these different approaches. I think I'm with you in that I see, I have a hard time imagining, at least to my mind, the most plausible scenario is some kind of network that is behind the letters at the very least, right?
Well, I mean, my doctor father is fond of saying, most writings that we have access to are written to someone, from someone to someone. And this seems to certainly be the case with a lot of like ancient Christian literature. So, to whom were these texts written? And it seems to me it's much more difficult to make this. I don't know if I'm constantly thinking about that which can solve the most problems while creating the fewest problems, right? Sort of an Occam's razor sort of a thing. And to me, arguing that this is coming from a fictive group that's trying to influence people, but it's these documents that only have several hundred words, to me, that runs into a lot more problems in the long run than saying, okay, these were written as a part of a correspondence that belongs to a certain group. Let's try to figure out where the seams are and where the problems are instead of going the opposite way. But again, we'll see. I'd be interested in another 5 to 10 years to see not only where this book takes the conversation, but where Hugo's book and where some of the other books that are being written recently that are about to be published are coming out on these issues. I'd like to see where that would take us.
Yeah, for sure. And where are I wasn't touched on a lot in the book, but I think it's an interesting point, one that I'm sure people listening or watching would value your input on is when we think about the Gospel of John itself, right? It seems like there are instances of, again, this might not be reflective of what's happening in an actual community or whatever,
right,
but there are these instances that talk about a schism. I'm thinking in particular at the end of John chapter 6, when the group leaves, a large group leaves Jesus, and then Peter says, "Where else would we go?" kind of thing, or whatever. Right. What's your thought about that kind of dynamic in the gospel itself, vis-a-vis the letters, where we then see very clearly those, First John, those who went out from us, they were not of us, kind of thing, and all that.
Yeah. No, I mean, so even going back to the aposunagogos language, right? I mean, we have to account for this language. I mean, we have a term that shows up nowhere in extant Greek literature before the fourth gospel. How do we get that? What is the genesis of that term, and why is it applied in these three specific instances in the fourth gospel, right? So that's language of conflict. And then we do have language of conflict between Jesus and hoi judaioi. And then we see another type of conflict, especially in First John, but also, Diotrephes loves to be first, in the epistles. I mean, we see, I think I think you have a weight of evidence over here about conflict that does need to be explained. And I think it's easier to explain it by assuming that these things are connected rather than the other model that tries to go away from it. I think this creates more problems. This solves more problems, doesn't answer every problem. But again, I'm always talking to my doctoral students about making an argument that's going to, especially in a thorny situation like this, that's going to solve the most number of problems while generating the fewest. And I'm with you. I think this whole question of conflict that we see literarily, I don't want to engage in a full mirror reading and give you 18 stages of the Johannine community, but I think there's something there and we have to take it seriously.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you think we see that dynamic even in the Gospels before the letters?
Yeah. I think we see it in both. Yeah. I guess I'm much more traditional in that way. Somewhere along the line, to have more traditional views in critical scholarship is it's a dirty word, but there are some positions that give it enough time, and it'll be the sexy position. Just give it enough time, man. No, for sure. But I mean, there's some views that I adopted early on that I found to be really useful. And I haven't abandoned them. But then, I always tell my students, you can't consider yourself truly educated unless you've changed your mind about at least one thing, right? And, I was really into the Jesus criteria when I first started working in historical Jesus. And I'm totally on board with the demise of the criteria stuff now. So there's some stuff that I bought into early on that I still think is very, it's explanatory. It has an explanatory power that I haven't given up on. And the Johannine community is one of those things, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm too traditional in that way, but I agree with you. I think we can see that sort of conflict working out in the Gospels and in the letters. And I think that can't be explained away so easily.
Yeah. Do you see the community as being more like sectarian, or is this... Or like, how do you? I mean, like, how do we view that? And like, what is your thinking of the group that does go out? Because there's only like little hints in terms of what they.
Yeah.
And I found even when I was teaching, graduate students, not doctoral, but master's level, right? Like, they're just reading the literature, and so they just keep using terms like Docetism and Gnosticism because those are the terms that previous scholars had used.
Yeah.
And it just creates a scenario where people who are looking for, how do we understand these texts? Like, they're given these categories that most scholars today would not use or would use with with like a lot of qualification.
Right.
But still the literature that everybody else is reading outside of this narrow field is diffused with these catchy terms. So
I had a professor that used to talk about pre-Gnostic Gnosticism and pre-Orthodox orthodoxy, things that are in terms of sectarian. I want to be careful with that term, and there's a reason I went. So a few years ago, back in 2017, Sherry Brown of Creighton and Sherry was one of my doctor sisters at CUA. We edited a book with Fortress on Johannine ethics. I had 3 chapters in that book. We had the intro, the closing chapter, and then I had a chapter on, basically, love in the farewell discourse, right? And I tried to make the argument that, that that the Johannine Jesus is not sectarian in the way that's so often been argued, that there's a movement from the particular to the universal, even in the prayer of Jesus in John 17. It ultimately, begins by praying for his disciples, but then it culminates in him praying for disciples of all time. But the farewell discourse begins in a very sectarian note when Jesus is speaking to just his disciples. But the word sectarian, makes me jumpy sometimes. So I don't think sectarian in the way that's always been described, but there's something going on in 1 John where there do seem to be 2 different sects or groups within the Johannine community that disagree over Christology, right? I don't know if I'd want to call them sects so much as, groups with different, groups with different, It's pretty nondescript, but groups,
Well, and what's funny is like if you take the Greek word hieresis, right, which sometimes it will get translated into English as sect. I do this as an exercise with students sometimes without even telling them, and I'll just translate hieresis as school or whatever. And it has a completely different feel then to an
Right.
English speaker. Like
Right.
you think sect, closed off group, hates the world.
Right.
School, oh, it's this
Oh yeah.
movement,
All are
whatever.
welcome. Yeah.
Yeah,
Come and
yeah,
join
yeah,
us.
yeah,
Sit at our
exactly.
feet, Yeah.
Right. But it's the same Greek word, right? It's
Yeah.
like, yeah. So,
I should try that sometime with my students. I should try that and see how it works.
Yeah. Let's see. No, that's good. What are some things like, having done this project, like that you are hoping, like where would you like to see the conversation go, kind of from here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because of my own circuitous journey, I've used the word circuitous, I think 4 times already now. Because of my own circuitous journey in the academy, I have 4 authored books, but I have a lot more edited books. And, there's a part of me that was kind of like trying to keep publishing just so I could get out of my previous post and kind of land where I am now. We all know how the journey works. So there were a fair number of things that I edited over the years. And one of the goals was to, in whatever way possible, generate some prospects that graduate students could then go, or even scholars in the field could then go on and say, how can I take this thing that's been argued here and move in a different direction? How can I push back against it? What sort of generative prospects are there for us here? The couple books that I did on characterization, I think have been successful in that. The book that Sherry and I did on implied ethics and John was moving that forward from some other stuff, but it's also some work has been done on that. So I like to think about this book, and it was a part of how Chris and I envisioned it in the beginning. We wanted a book that would take new constructive proposals, but would provide things that would allow prospects upon which new work could be launched. And so I don't know that I care that much about what angles are taken, what arguments are used, but I think there's a ton of stuff in this book that you got somebody now and they're like, okay, I'm heading off to St. Andrews, right? Or I'm heading off to Catholic U, or I'm heading off to Loyola, wherever. There's some things in there that someone could say, hey, I read this thing and it sparked this idea in me. And I think there's something really constructive in this proposal that could help me argue for either the existence of a Johannine community or a Johannine social network, or could help me advance this idea that, no, this is all being produced in a community of elite cultural producers that is working just the way ancient writers used to work, right? So I don't know that I'm vested as much in a specific avenue as much as I am this work being something that really helps people have prospects for future research. That was really one of our goals in publishing the book.
Yeah, very good. And I should mention this because I don't think it's come up yet. The second half of the book is scholars responding to the proposals in the first half, while also providing their own constructives.
Significant senior scholars. Make sure significant. Alicia Myers, Adele Reinhardt, and Paul Anderson.
Paul Anderson. And those essays are really valuable too, because for students, you get to see how scholars engage with one another, how they connect that with their own work, and then each of those essays do a nice job, I think, of kind of setting the table for further work. I was thinking Adele Reinhardt's essay is the last one in the book, and I thought that was a really nice kind of closing, because there was something about the way she just kind of laid that essay out that I think sets the table for people to keep going with the conversation.
I want to be Adele Reinhardt's when I grow up. She's kind of one of my academic heroes. So I've had an opportunity to work with her on a few things, and we're on the Johannine Literature Steering Committee for SBO. And she's an excellent human and just a great scholar. So I was glad that she agreed to do that, because she's very busy. So the very fact that she agreed, that made us happy. That's a great essay. Anything else we would talk about? I mean, we didn't really. You had mentioned as an aside the issue of John's writings and Judaism and how to handle Hoyudaioe. I mean, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that. Obviously, that was a big part of Adele's project. Or anything else you want to talk about. Yeah, I just think it's it's one of those. It's funny. I gave a paper in November on this very issue. Raising the question, does the fourth gospel? I was on a session devoted to John 18 and 19, the trial scene, and arguing, this question, does the trial sequence in the fourth gospel, is there a kind of literary approach to this address accusations of John's ostensible supersessionism or anti-Judaism? Anti-Judaism, I think, yes. And I think a big part of that is how we treat Hoyudaioe. I'm not as convinced that we can avoid claims of supersessionism as it relates to the fourth gospel. And I think we need to be honest about that. I mean, there are things about the fourth gospel that I absolutely love. And there are things that as a scholar, as a Christian, make me quite uncomfortable, especially in light of, how much I care about some of my Jewish colleagues that I'm very close to. So, the way we handle Hoyudayo is very important, not just for thinking about the community issues and thinking about this conflict, but it's also important for avoiding the way we teach and preach the gospel, avoiding sort of anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish interpretation. I think that needs to be said more clearly, especially in seminary classrooms, right?
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, and I think it might have been in Alicia Meyer's essay. She also brought up a good point. It wasn't her main point, but kind of towards the end, that what happens sometimes in within within Christianity is we talk about like Judaism being kind of this particularistic thing, and then Christianity moving towards the universal.
Right.
And she notes within the Roman context, right, there is a kind of Romanness to claiming universality, right?
Right.
And while that can be a very good thing and a beautiful thing, like, hey, everybody's welcome, all are part of this.
Right.
There's ways in which universalisms in various ways erase the particularity of different peoples. And that can also have problems. And we have a legacy of dealing with that as well. So that's another facet that we have to think through if we're talking about these texts of scripture, preaching, teaching, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's like,
right.
How does the claim like, hey, your people group, your identity, none of that really matters. You just, are you a child of God? And then you're part of this bigger thing. And so,
I mean, and sometimes because we care about these texts, and for many of us, these texts are normative, right? We want to kind of with a swipe of the hand, get rid of some of the problems. I had I taught synoptics for graduate students this semester among the classes that I taught. And I had a first year doctoral student who, he was looking at feminist approaches, especially to Mark 5. And he was looking at, this whole intercalated passage, which I know well. And he wanted to argue that, Jesus is breaking down all these barriers and he's doing this and this and this. And I said, wait a minute, okay, can we have a pro-woman Jesus in Mark 5? Yes. In fact, I think we do. And I think we can make, but let's not take a contemporary method and then just with a swipe of our hand, get rid of all the problems in the text, because there are still problems there, right? And those problems are connected to the particularity of Christian claims, right? So I totally agree with what you're saying there. There's problems maybe with both the universalisms and the particularisms, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, this was such a great conversation, Chris. Thanks so much for chatting. Yeah, it's really fun. I mean, I could talk to you for hours. This is great stuff. And this
I'm writing a book on Mark, so I'm going to be reaching out to you.
I'll have you on to talk about Mark, that for sure. And this is actually the first conversation we've had about John or Johannine related material on the podcast. So great. You have the honor of being the first there. But it's good stuff. I've been wanting to do more with John just because. Yeah, it's important stuff, and we haven't had a chance to talk that. It's funny, like we're more gospel guys, but I feel like a lot of this podcast stuff has been dominated by Paul.
Right.
Go figure, right?
A lot of our field is dominated by Paul, right?
Well, so that's how it goes, right?
We got to steal some of that ground back, right?
Right. You got to take it back. Yeah, exactly. So glad to add your voice to it, and again, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.